Boldwood presents Murder at Waldenmere Lake, written by Michelle Salter and read by Polly Edsel. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. Waldenmere Lake, November 1918. Silently, the metal beast began to descend. Water closed over it. Ripples subsided, and no trace was left. Nothing to say it had ever been there. Waldenmere was motionless once more. The soldiers watched the man scramble to shore. His uniform was caked in mud, and he struggled to stay upright in the waist-high water. They heard him swear when his torchlight flickered and died. After the man had gone, they crept from their hiding place and returned to camp. The soldiers would say nothing of what they had seen. Soon they'd be gone from here, back to their old lives. War was over. Peace was just beginning. Chapter 1. Walden, Hampshire, May 1921.
Waldenmere is not for sale!
General Cheverton burst into the office, waving the latest edition of the Walden Herald. He marched past my desk, his silver-topped cane tapping on the wooden floor.
Good afternoon, Miss Woodmore.
Elijah, who'd been dozing in his chair, woke with a start. He struggled to his feet as the General slapped the newspaper on his desk. It contained an article suggesting the army was about to sell Waldenmere to the highest bidder. The Walden Herald's headquarters consisted of 2 rooms above Lafay Printworks. Its editor, Elijah Whittle, ran operations from his smoke-filled den, where he could keep an eye on me and anyone entering the main office. I was the only permanent reporter. The rest of the newspaper's staff were housed in the printworks below.
Waldenmere belongs to the British Army.
General Cheverton lowered his tall frame into a chair.
It should belong to the people of Walden.
Elijah rummaged through the papers strewn across his desk, searching for his cigarettes. I stopped typing so I could listen to their conversation.
I know townsfolk are sentimental about the lake.
The General took out his pipe, and Elijah passed him a box of matches.
But our plans won't cause any disruption. We just want to give our war heroes somewhere peaceful to recuperate.
I've heard the army doesn't have the funds for a convalescent home.
Elijah took back the matches and lit a cigarette.
It's in hand.
A halo of smoke circled General Cheverton's mane of grey hair.
These things always take time.
Why not let the council buy the lake? That way its future is more secure.
Elijah was fast disappearing behind his own cloud of smog.
It's not a risk. Townsfolk will always be welcome at Waldenmere.
But they were forced to keep away during the war.
I coughed as tobacco fumes wafted across my desk.
There's a difference between active soldiers and veterans. Now the training camp is gone, local people can enjoy the lake alongside recovering soldiers.
The General puffed contentedly on his pipe, while Elijah took long drags from his cigarette. They appeared to be enjoying their exchange. With 52 acres of open water, Waldenmere was the perfect location for a convalescent home. Before the war, the lake had been used to trial float planes, and prototype battle tanks had been tested on its marshes. In 1914, a military camp was erected on the lake's shores and remained there for 5 years. Locals had been hostile towards the army camp, and most were in favour of the council buying Waldenmere. However, General Samuel Cheverton was a popular figure in Walden, and many would be swayed by his view. I was torn between my personal attachment to the lake and a sense of obligation to those men who'd given so much for their country. Deep down, I wanted Waldenmere to go back to the way it had been in my childhood, and had misgivings about an institution looming over its shores. The lake was an old friend to me, and I didn't want it to change. Elijah hefted himself out of his chair and fished a whiskey bottle and 2 glasses from the filing cabinet. I started to type. He smiled at my futile attempt to pretend I hadn't been listening and kicked his office door closed. The only sound was the noise of the printing presses below. I decided to leave them to their whiskey and coax any gossip out of Elijah in the morning. It was nearly 6, and George might be waiting for me downstairs. I took out my powder compact and checked my face in the tiny mirror. Picking up my jacket and bag, I was about to leave when Elijah reappeared.
"Make sure you're here by 9 tomorrow. We have an appointment with Mrs. Siddons at the council offices."
He slammed the door shut before I could ask any questions. I went downstairs and emerged onto Queen's Road into a sticky heat. The smell of ink chemicals rose through the grate of the print works, replacing the clinging odour of tobacco fumes from above. At last. George was standing in the doorway of the print works. His jacket was slung over his arm, and his tie hung loosely around his neck. He tossed his cigarette to the ground, and we strolled along the road until we reached the shortcut to the lake. By taking a footpath that ran through the woods and then curved alongside Grebe Stream, we could follow the flow of water until it wound its way into Waldenmere.
"You're late? Don't tell me something newsworthy has happened in Walden."
George worked in the council offices on the High Street. When he finished at 5:30, he'd stroll down to Queen's Road to wait for me. He was never in a hurry to catch the train home to Basingstoke. Instead, we strolled by the lake together, and at some point he'd end up at the railway station. "It's this lake business. General Cheverton paid us a visit to put us right about the army's plans."
"What did he say?"
"Apparently, Aldershot Military Estates, the army unit that holds the land deeds, has no intention of selling Waldenmere to anyone."
"I'm not sure that's true."
He admitted they don't have the funds to build the convalescent home yet, but he's adamant it will go ahead. I think he just wanted to chew the fat with Elijah. The whiskey bottle was out by the time I left. Have you heard anything?
"Nothing I can tell a reporter," George teased. "You should ask your friend, Mrs. Siddons."
"I will. We've got a meeting with her tomorrow at the council offices. Has she taken up residence there?" I could imagine her commandeering an office.
"She has. I'm exhausted."
I noticed he walked a little stiffly and tried to slow my pace without him noticing. I don't imagine Mansbridge is happy about that. The previous year, Mrs. Siddons had become MP for Aldershot and the 3rd woman to take a seat in the House of Commons. She'd done it by standing as the Liberal candidate in the local by-election and beating their Conservative candidate, Councillor William Mansbridge. He yawned.
"She's had us digging out old maps and finding out about boundary lines."
"Does that mean she's the one behind the plan for the council to buy the lake?" He nodded. "Excellent. That means it has a chance of happening." He didn't seem convinced, but I knew how influential Mrs. Siddons could be. Even before she'd entered Parliament, she'd moved in political circles and had the ear of Prime Minister Lloyd George.
"How did you become friends with the famous Mrs. Siddons?"
he asked. We left the footpath and pushed our way through the bracken to reach Bog Myrtle Glade and the seclusion of our bench. She was kind to me after my mother died. I didn't want to talk about that. I looked over at the lake, bathed in sunshine. It was beautiful. The air was still, and the only sound came from a warbler singing from the cover of the reed beds.
"Will Elijah be with you tomorrow?"
George stretched out his leg. I suspected he was in pain, but I knew better than to ask. I nodded.
"Does he know
He trailed off. I guessed he wasn't sure how to describe our relationship. No. No one does. I felt a little embarrassed. Tomorrow's encounter could be awkward.
Shall I pretend I don't know you?
His dark eyes crinkled in amusement. Of course not. Just don't. It was my turn to fumble for the right words. Don't what? He whispered into my ear, his nose touching my face. Don't let on that we've been spending so much time together. I kissed him lightly on the nose to temper the meaning behind my words.
I get the picture.
He moved away from me to the end of the bench.
I wouldn't want anyone to get the impression we were anything more than casual acquaintances.
I'm just worried about your reputation. He laughed and slid back to wrap his arms around me. Few people knew our bench existed. It had been there so long, the roots of an ancient oak had grown over its iron legs. The canopy of the tree hid us from view. We could glimpse the lake in the distance, but no one could see us.
Water hides its secrets,
George observed. What do you mean? I touched his cheek, tracing the line of a faint scar that ran along his left temple before disappearing under a mess of dark curls. The same shellfire that had injured his left leg had also grazed the side of his face.
Look at the land, and you'll find telltale signs of war. But water swallows everything up. When this place was an army camp, it was all mud and machinery.
George motioned towards the reed beds.
You can still see traces of it. Bits of metal here and there, old boundary stones. But the lake stays the same. It doesn't reveal anything.
When I lived in London, I'd dream about Waldenmere. I followed his gaze across the water. It was comforting. The lake was something constant, unchanging. I found it reassuring when everything else was chaos.
Is that why you came back?
He took my hand and placed it around his waist. I moved in closer. It was my father's idea. He thought we'd be happier here. I wasn't so sure, but I couldn't get a job with any of the London newspapers. Elijah's an old family friend, and he offered to take me on at the Walden Herald.
Don't you miss London?
I smiled. George couldn't understand why anyone would want to leave the city to settle in a small market town in Hampshire. Sometimes, I admitted. But I'm not sorry we came back.
Nor am I. Otherwise, we may never have met.
He trailed his finger down my cheek and gently turned my face towards his. What's this meeting about? I asked Elijah. The lake?
I'm assuming Mrs. Siddons is behind the proposal for the council to buy Waldenmere. No doubt she'll let Mansbridge think it's his idea.
When I walked with George, I'd learned how to discreetly slow down if I saw signs his leg was aching. With Elijah, I found it more difficult not to stride ahead. Despite our gentle progress, he was still red in the face by the time we arrived at the council offices.
Here's George Hale, Elijah panted. I'll buy him a pint in the Drunken Duck later and see what he's got to say about all this.
Elijah, how are you?
George slapped him on the back.
Hello, George. You know Iris, don't you?
George gave a formal nod in my direction, and I reciprocated with a polite incline of my head. I could see the laughter in his eyes.
Mrs. Siddons is with Councillor Mansbridge in the meeting room. I'll show you up.
Elijah leant heavily on the polished oak banister, breathing hard as he made his way up the curved staircase. George and I followed, exchanging sidelong smiles. See you tonight, he mouthed. I held up 6 fingers to indicate the time. He nodded. Elijah turned at the top of the stairs and noticed the last few seconds of this exchange. "I'll see if they're ready for you." George left us to wait in a small antechamber.
"You and George friends, eh?"
Elijah raised his eyebrows. "We've chatted a few times." I pretended to examine the portrait of a bearded man who looked a bit like King George. The plaque revealed he was Alderman Redvers Tolfrey.
Well, be careful. He's likeable enough, but I'm not sure your father would approve."
With my father away on his travels, Elijah had the vague notion he should adopt a sort of parental role. Fortunately, he hadn't got a clue how to go about it. "Don't worry, I'm not planning on marrying him," I replied, and instantly regretted it. Elijah's eyebrows shot up again.
"What are you planning on doing with him?"
His tone was cynical. "We enjoy each other's company." I felt my cheeks flush. I didn't plan on marrying anyone, but I relished having a boyfriend, especially a secret one.
"I know you think you should be able to do anything a man can do, but I'm afraid the world doesn't work that way."
"The world's changing." I kept my eyes fixed on the portrait of Alderman Tolfrey.
"Not that fast, it isn't. Don't risk your reputation on the likes of George Hale. Walden's a small town, with wagging tongues."
It was a relief when George reappeared. He ushered us into an austere meeting room, dominated by a huge mahogany table. The walls were clad in dark wood and hung with portraits of former council leaders. "Please take a seat." Councillor William Mansbridge stood to greet us. His 6-foot frame and black hair and beard made him a distinctive figure in Walden. "Thank you, George." George left the room, and Mrs. Siddons got straight down to business. She was resplendent, in a dark blue satin gown with glistening sapphire earrings and a sapphire ring from her famous jewellery collection. "I'm sure you're aware of the rumours circulating regarding the future ownership of Waldenmere. We'd like to inform your readers of the current state of affairs." I took out my notebook. I knew from experience Mrs. Siddons could impart a lot of information in a short space of time. "It's true Walden Council has expressed an interest in buying the lake. However, no agreement has been reached with Aldershot Military Estates. The Army may wish to retain Waldenmere if they can find the funds to build a convalescent home for war veterans." She gave a politician's pause. "This may seem like a noble idea, but it doesn't take into account the impact this type of establishment could have on the town. The council would raise objections to such a development." Councillor Mansbridge didn't appear as comfortable as Mrs. Siddons about this, but he leant back, allowing her to take the lead.
"General Cheverton believes he can drum up enough investment to enable the convalescent home to go ahead,"
Elijah commented. Mrs. Siddons sighed. "He'd better start tapping his contacts to stump up the cash soon, because time's running out. A third party is interested in buying Waldenmere, and they have deeper pockets than the council and army put together." "Who?" I demanded. Even Elijah looked startled. This hadn't been mentioned before. "London and South Western Railway. They plan to build a 4-storey hotel on the northern side of the lake, next to the station." "No," I gasped. Chapter 2.
"Take notes, but don't ask any questions, and don't show any hostility to the man. Understood?"
Elijah sat in the corner of the carriage, his hat resting on his lap. To my amazement, he'd managed to secure a meeting at short notice with Sir Henry Ballard of London and South Western Railway. Like many people, I sometimes underestimated my boss. His shambling gait and vague air belied the fact that he was extremely astute and with an extensive network of contacts from all walks of life.
"I'll mention the concerns of the townspeople. He'll expect that. But he needs to know we'll present his side of the story too.
Elijah waved his cigarette at me.
He'll give us more information that way.
The London train pulled out of Walden Station, and I stared out at the shimmering lake. I couldn't imagine a hotel looming over Waldenmere. The idea was preposterous. London and South Western Railway's head office was inside Waterloo Station. A secretary escorted us into a drab room with grimy windows that overlooked the platforms. The smell of burnt coal seemed to have permeated the wallpaper. A large map covered one wall, dotted with key railway stations across the south of the country. It showed where railway hotels had already been built and indicated proposed sites for new ones. It already displayed an outline of the Waldenmere Hotel. Whereas his office was plain and workmanlike, Sir Henry Ballard was flamboyantly dressed in a checkered waistcoat and polka-dot bow tie. He followed my gaze and pointed to the map.
The latest addition to our chain.
If you're successful in buying the lake,
Elijah corrected.
Of course.
Sir Henry raised his hands in concession.
We still have matters to settle, but I hope to have a team of men on site before the year's out.
You'll appreciate your plan has caused some unease. Locals are worried about the damage that could be done to Waldenmere, and they're concerned about the numbers of visitors a large hotel will bring to the town.
Elijah relayed these facts without emotion.
Walden is a quiet place.
And we want it to stay that way, I was tempted to add, but remained silent.
I understand, Mr. Whittle. Change of any sort causes unrest. But once the hotel is up and running, locals will soon adjust to its presence.
But most of your hotels have been built in cities or coastal resorts. Walden is a small and relatively new town. We've only had a council for about 20 years.
Elijah commented.
I know Walden's history, and the part the railway played in its creation. Don't forget that.
Sir Henry tucked his thumbs into his waistcoat pockets.
Walden is a major attraction for visitors. The last thing we want to do is detract from its appeal, but a few modifications may be necessary.
What do you mean, modifications? I didn't like the sound of this. Elijah coughed in my direction.
Nothing that need worry you, Miss Woodmore. I know large-scale building works can be frightening when you first witness them.
Sir Henry smiled at me.
Hasn't that always been the case since the dawn of the railway? Yet where would we be now if we didn't have trains to take us from one end of the country to the other, eh?
I'm just curious to know how you go about modifying a lake. I forced a smile, irked by his patronizing manner.
An excellent question. Let me enlighten you.
He spread out a map across his desk. It showed Waldenmere, with a hotel standing next to the railway station.
As you can see, the water runs into the lake from Grebe Stream by Heron Bay on the south side. On the north side of the lake, not far from the railway line, there's a weir with a sluice that we can raise to let the water flow into Walden Brook and onto the River Hart. By temporarily draining the lake, we can create a northern bay similar to Heron Bay.
I was infuriated by his presumption that he could buy Waldenmere and change it to suit his needs.
Our hotel will be close to the railway station, and the new bay will sit in front of it. We can form a shallow bathing area by cutting away the existing reed beds and shipping in tons of sand. A promenade will run alongside the bay, leading to a boathouse on the northeast corner of the lake to facilitate boating. Once the work is complete, we'll return the water level to normal.
I struggled to hide my dismay at the thought of my beloved lake being turned into a seaside resort.
I'm sorry if I'm frightening you with my talk of construction.
He stroked his moustache.
When the railway first came to Britain, vast swathes of countryside were ravaged, much to the alarm of those living in the vicinity. Once those lines were in place, everything soon returned to normal. On his desk was a photograph of a well-dressed woman with 2 young girls, presumably his wife and children. They were standing on an immaculate lawn in front of a palatial manor house. I wondered how the Ballard family would feel if LSWR decided to route a railway line through their garden.
Are you suggesting we focus on the benefits the hotel could bring the town?
Elijah prompted.
Sir Henry beamed at him.
Precisely, Mr. Whittle. Think of the advantages a hotel would offer. It will create new and exciting jobs, and local merchants will be delighted by the increase in trade. I'm sure the good people of your town will flock to be seen in the hotel's bar and restaurant.
I tried, unsuccessfully, to picture the inhabitants of Walden in suits and evening dresses, sipping cocktails in the lounge of the Waldenmere Hotel.
For a fee, day visitors will be allowed to join our paying guests in the swimming pool or bathe in the lake during the summer months.
Locals bathe in the lake for free all year round. I couldn't resist commenting.
But at the hotel, they'll be able to recline on sun lounges, order drinks from the bar, and bask in the beauty of the lake in luxurious surroundings.
You seem confident Aldershot military estates will agree to sell.
Elijah's fingers twitched, and I could tell he was longing for a cigarette.
I've spoken to my fellow board members here at the LSWR. They fully back the scheme. I'm confident we'll be able to make Aldershot an offer it can't refuse.
What about Mill Ponds? I scrutinised the map. Isn't that where you want to build your promenade?
The old house that was a training academy? I'm sure we can get the army to throw it in as a part of the deal.
The army doesn't own Mill Ponds. I was jubilant at having found a flaw in his plan. Sir Henry seemed taken aback.
Are you sure? It was used to train officers during the war, wasn't it?
That's right,
Elijah said.
General Cheverton gave it over to the war effort. An officer cadet battalion was there from 1916 till 1918. But the general never moved out and still lives at Mill Ponds.
That wiped the smile from Sir Henry's face.
It's something I'll need to investigate.
Do you have a drawing of what the hotel might look like?
Elijah asked. Sir Henry took down a photograph that had been pinned to the wall.
This is the South Eastern Hotel in Deal, in Kent. It has 80 bedrooms, lifts to the upper floors, and electric lighting throughout. It sits right on the seafront with its own promenade. Beautiful, isn't it? Can you picture it on the shores of Waldenmere?
I couldn't hide my horror at the thought of such a vast building towering over the lake. It was monstrous. Even Elijah, who'd remained impassive throughout, looked shocked by the size of it. We thanked Sir Henry for his time and left him poring over the map, frowning over the problem of Mill Ponds. How can this be allowed to happen? I exploded. Elijah beckoned me to keep my voice down. We'd walked over Waterloo Bridge and found a table at the Lion's Corner house on the Strand. He picked up the coffee pot and filled our cups.
I'm flabbergasted LSWR considers Waldenmere a suitable location for a railway hotel. They usually prefer big cities or seaside towns.
I chewed on my fish paste sandwich, shaking my head in disbelief. Can't the council do something?
Mrs. Siddons may have her connections, but the railway companies are too powerful. I'm not sure she'll have enough influence to stop this.
And LSWR is likely to be the highest bidder, isn't it?
Probably.
He drained his coffee and refilled his cup.
Even with Horace's help, the council is unlikely to be able to match the financial clout of the railway.
Mr. Le Fay, how's he involved? Horace Le Fay was the owner of the Walden Herald and Le Fay Printworks. I moved the plate of sandwiches towards Elijah. He'd survive on coffee and cigarettes unless prompted. He ate a ham sandwich without enthusiasm.
He's been meeting with the council to try to help them broker a deal with Aldershot military estates.
How? I tucked into a slice of fruitcake. I was starving, even if Elijah wasn't.
He's using his military connections to put pressure on Aldershot to sell to the council.
He and Horace had much in common. Both had contacts in high places, though Elijah also had some rather shady connections in distinctly low places. Mr. Le Fay won't appreciate tourists on his doorstep, I commented, or a hotel ruining his view. Horace Le Fay's house overlooked Heron Bay. He was already opposed to the plans for a neighbouring convalescent home. A hotel across the lake would be even less welcome. Horace wanted Walden and Waldenmere to stay just the way they were.
He'll loathe it. He doesn't like disruption. He had enough of that during the war with the army camp.
Elijah scowled into his coffee cup. A cloud of gloom seemed to have descended on him. I could guess why. Horace wasn't just his boss. The two shared a close personal relationship. I'd come to realise they were partners in life as well as business, not that it could ever be publicly known. If Horace decided to move away, Elijah would be heartbroken, and if the Walden Herald folded, he'd also be out of a job. I thought it unlikely that Horace would part with Elijah. He'd want him to come too. And where would that leave me? We lapsed into silence while I finished the rest of the food and he drained the coffee pot. After lunch, Elijah went to meet with an old colleague for a drink, and I took the opportunity to go to Dolly Dawes' hair salon. My short bob was considered too modern for provincial Walden, and I couldn't find a local hairdresser who'd attempt it. I met Elijah back at Waterloo at 4 o'clock. He eyed my hair suspiciously.
Planning on seeing George later?
No.
What happened to young Baverstock?
He climbed into an empty carriage and sank into a seat by the window. Nothing's happened to him, I said in exasperation. He was just a friend. I had been keen on Percy Baverstock. However, he proved to be unpredictable with his affections.
So George is more than a friend.
Elijah smirked. I didn't mean that. To my relief, he grunted, drew his hat over his eyes, and was snoring within minutes. I woke him up as we pulled into Walden Station. Stepping down from the train onto the platform felt like entering a gentler, more tranquil world after the bustle of London. We strolled out to the station concourse, and at the same time, both stopped. In unison, we turned to look towards Mill Ponds. Do you think the General will sell? I asked. Only 4 houses were situated around the lake. On the south side was Heron Bay Lodge, home to Horace Le Fay. His neighbour was Mrs. Siddons in Grebe House. To the east was Sand Hills Hall, belonging to Colonel Thackeray, and on the northeast corner stood Mill Ponds.
I can't see it. Rumour has it Colonel Thackeray's been trying to persuade the old boy to move out and let them convert Mill Ponds into a convalescent home rather than building on Heron Bay. But the General's determined to stay put.
He's not likely to be persuaded by the railway company then? I felt more optimistic.
Let's ask him.
With an abrupt change of direction, Elijah turned away from the road into town and took the lake path to Mill Ponds. 5 minutes later, we were strolling up the long driveway towards the red brick house. It was an impressive building, though it had seen better days. The roof and chimneys were in need of repair, but there was still a grandeur about the place. If these walls could talk, they'd tell tales of wartime plots and official secrets. Elijah rapped on the oak front door. All was quiet, so we went around to the side of the house, where the French doors to the General's study were open.
"General Cheverton,"
Elijah called, peering into the room. I turned to look towards Waldenmere. Heavily scented pink and lilac rose bushes provided bursts of colour against the silver backdrop of the lake. With a view like that, I didn't blame General Cheverton for not wanting to leave his home. Hearing a strange gasp, I spun around.
"Stay here."
Elijah held up his hand to stop me. I hung back, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed him into the room, my eyes drawn to a vivid splash of red. The General's body lay at an awkward angle on the floor, blocking the doorway into the study from the house. His mouth was open, and his white shirt was stained with blood. A shotgun lay on the rug beside him. Chapter 3. I clamped my hand over my mouth. Elijah walked over to the body and raised a lifeless wrist. Blood seeped from General Cheverton's chest.
"He's dead."
He went to the telephone, dialed the operator, and asked to be put through to the station house. I inspected the room. Papers were scattered across the desk, and a drawer of one of the cabinets was open. It gave the impression the General had been searching for something, or someone had. Elijah put down the receiver and shooed me back into the garden.
"Ben Gilbert's coming over."
So much blood. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath.
God knows what he was doing with that shotgun.
We walked back towards the driveway. It happened not long ago, by the look of it. He glanced at me in surprise.
"You've seen dead bodies before?"
"Many. I was a volunteer at Lewisham Military Hospital towards the end of the war, and I saw my mother's body," I added, then wished I hadn't as the image of her came back to me. He reached into his pocket for his cigarettes. With shaking hands, he lit one and inhaled greedily. He offered me the packet, but I shook my head. "Do you think he shot himself?" My eyes were drawn back to the house.
"More likely an accident. He wasn't as sharp as he used to be. Or maybe there was something wrong with the gun. It looked old."
He drew deeply on his cigarette. I tried to block out the scene in the study and turned to the lake. A pair of swans glided through the water, watched by a crow perched on the branch of a willow. The view was ludicrously peaceful compared to the violence we'd just witnessed. A scream jolted me back to the present, and we ran to the house. Betty Akers, General Cheverton's housekeeper, was standing by the study door, staring in horror at his body. Elijah stepped across the room, took her hand and guided her into the garden. I couldn't help peeking again at the dishevelled corpse before I followed them.
"The General,"
Betty muttered. I took her hand from Elijah's. We were waiting for the police to arrive, but we thought the house was empty.
"I only just got back. I went straight to the kitchen."
Betty began to gabble.
"I've been into town to fetch something nice for his supper. I'm a bit late as I was chatting with your Lizzie. I unpacked the shopping and went to see if he'd like a cup of tea and—"
A bicycle swung into the driveway, and PC Ben Gilbert dismounted. "The doctor's on his way. Superintendent Cobb is coming over from Aldershot. Elijah, will you show me the body? Iris, could you take Mrs. Akers to the kitchen?" Given the rarity of any serious crime in Walden, I was impressed by how assured Ben was. The town didn't have a police station, just a station house Ben shared with PC Sid King. I took Betty by the elbow and steered her towards the door of the scullery. In the familiar surroundings of her kitchen, she seemed to revive. "Sit down, Miss Iris. I'll make tea." She busied herself by the stove, heating a kettle of water. The kitchen was cavernous, with a series of smaller spaces leading from it, including the scullery, larder and laundry room. All manner of pots and pans filled the shelves, but most looked as though they hadn't been touched in a while. However, judging by the smell of fruitcake, the baking tins were still in regular use. Why don't I do that? Despite its size, I could see which items in the kitchen Betty favoured. On the lowest shelf of the sideboard was a row of faded rose-patterned plates and matching cups and saucers. Betty hesitated, then sank into a heavily cushioned chair and wept. I pottered by the stove to give her time and privacy to cry.
He was definitely dead, wasn't he?
She sniffed into her handkerchief. I'm afraid so. I poured boiling water into a tarnished silver teapot and took cups and saucers from the sideboard, examining a row of recipe books on the shelf. I wondered how often Betty got to prepare exotic dishes nowadays.
It was that horrible old shotgun of his. He should have got rid of it years ago. It must have gone off by accident.
It looks like it was a gunshot wound. The doctor will examine him. I thought of the way the papers on his desk were scattered about, but that could have been due to a breeze through the open doors. Was he working in his study today?
He doesn't do much in there apart from writing the odd letter. Most of those cabinets haven't been opened since the war.
A drawer of one was pulled out. Perhaps the General was searching for something? I placed a cup of tea by her side.
He was an orderly man as a rule, although he'd make a mess when he couldn't find something. He tended to forget where he put things. Usually it was his spectacles or his pipe. Then he'd turn everything out to try to find them.
What's in those filing cabinets?
War records. For the soldiers that were here. They should go over to Aldershot, but no one's ever come to take them away. I think the army thought they'd get this place and the General would move somewhere smaller, but he was having none of it.
She raised the teacup to her lips, but tears began to spill down her pink cheeks, and she put it back in its saucer. Is it just you and the General living here? She nodded.
All the trainee officers left at the end of the war. We had a house full of them at one time, and makeshift dormitories in the grounds.
I imagined the kitchen bustling with staff, with dozens of soldiers to feed.
A girl comes in of a morning to help me with the cleaning.
She suddenly looked bewildered.
What am I going to do? What will happen to Mill Ponds?
Don't worry about that now. When the police have finished here, you're coming home with me. Betty dissolved into tears. Ben Gilbert poked his head around the door. Is she up to answering some questions? He whispered. I went over to him. She's becoming more distressed. I want to take her home to Lizzie. Our housekeeper, Mrs. Elizabeth Heathcote, had been friends with Betty since they were girls. He nodded and disappeared. A few minutes later, he returned to say he'd arranged for us to be driven home in Superintendent Cobb's car. Betty and I sat in the back, while Elijah got in the front. The car pulled away, and I looked back at the tall figure of the superintendent standing outside the open doors of the study. I shuddered at the thought of the General's body lying beyond him on the rug. We made the short journey to 9 Chestnut Avenue in silence, apart from the sound of Betty's sobs. Come upstairs with me, Lizzie instructed. You're going to lie down on my bed while I make up the spare room. Elijah slumped into one of the high-backed leather armchairs in the drawing room. I went to Father's drinks cabinet and poured us each a brandy before sinking into the chair opposite him. I shivered. It was too warm to light the fire, but I felt chilled.
I'm sorry you had to see that. Elijah rubbed his eyes. It's not something a woman of your age should have to witness.
I shrugged. I saw worse at the military hospital. I was with a voluntary aid detachment when you and Father were in France.
It must have been a harrowing experience.
It was unbearable at times, but then so was sitting at home doing nothing. I joined in 1916 and started looking after refugees at the Park Fever Hospital in Hither Green. Then I moved to Lewisham Military Hospital. That came as a shock. I forced a laugh.
I can imagine.
He ran nicotine-stained fingers through his thinning grey hair. Tending to the refugees had been hard, but rewarding work. It hadn't prepared me for the horrors of a military hospital. I shuddered as I recalled my time on the wards. Some days had seemed like a blood-soaked nightmare, an unrelenting parade of torn limbs on stretchers. I thought my role would be to talk to the men and write letters for them, that sort of thing. But they had me carrying slop buckets and swabbing wounds. I felt sick most of the time. I realised I'd make a terrible nurse. The brandy burned my throat, although the sensation wasn't unpleasant. He gave a weak smile.
I wasn't exactly cut out to be a soldier. Unfit and over 50 when I joined your father in the intelligence corps. I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. Officers like Colonel Thackeray weren't keen on us non-military types, but General Cheverton was always kind. I miss the old boy.
His voice was gruff.
I'm not sure I'd have survived the war without him, or your father.
Father didn't tell me until after the war that he'd spent time at Mill Ponds. It was what made him decide we should come back to Walden. I took another sip of brandy, its warmth starting to thaw the chill.
We weren't there for long. The place was bursting at the seams. They'd billeted commissioned officers in the house, while lower orders were camped out in tents in the grounds.
It was kind of the general to give up his home like that.
The old boy loved having the place overrun with soldiers. Every day was an adventure for him back then. Never seen him so alive. And he looked after his men, not like Thackeray. But Thackeray was the one running the training courses for the battalion.
I've heard my father say he could be rather harsh at times. I posed the question carefully. In fact, my father had said little about his wartime experiences, but I'd always sensed an underlying hostility between him and Colonel Thackeray whenever they met. I could tell by the stiffness in Father's manner that he disliked the Colonel, although they were always scrupulously polite to one another. I was close friends with the Colonel's daughter, Alice Thackeray, and I knew Father was fond of her too. Elijah grunted.
Thackeray's a snob. Not just a common or garden snob. It runs deep with him.
What do you mean?
At the start of the war, to get a commission, you had to have come from a university officer cadet training unit, or at least a public school one. But by 1916 they were in desperate need of officers, so they set up the officer cadet battalion. If you had a bit more intelligence than your fellow soldiers, you were in with a chance of getting into the battalion, much to Thackeray's chagrin.
He drained his glass.
When it came to training cadets, he didn't judge them on their abilities, but their social background. If you were working class, you were straight off to France to be cannon fodder.
I closed my eyes, remembering my father's letters. Certain things he'd written at that time started to make sense, or rather things that he'd alluded to but not been able to say. Father wanted to write about it, didn't he? My father and Elijah had been journalists for the Daily Telegraph for many years. During the war, Father had become frustrated with the propaganda circulated by the government and military, and especially newspaper proprietors. He'd left the paper to become a freelance writer, working for various news syndicates.
We both did. But we were suffering heavy losses and badly needed officers. Thackeray knew how to train them. It would have been considered treason to write anything against the war effort.
He sighed.
No one would have published it anyway.
Is that when you decided to leave the Telegraph?
I knew your father would go freelance once the war was over. I'd planned to retire. Take up gardening or something.
He smiled.
Horace already had the print works and thought a local paper would be a profitable business venture. He decided to launch the Walden Herald and asked if I'd run it.
Like General Cheverton, Elijah was not a man suited to retirement. He was happiest when he was working, and I'd long suspected Horace had created the Walden Herald out of love. I got up and refilled our glasses. It had been a long day. Was it only this morning we'd sat in Sir Henry's office when he showed us his plans for the hotel? What do you think will happen to Mill Ponds now? I can't bear the thought of it falling into Sir Henry's hands. Elijah's face crumpled.
The timing couldn't be worse.
If LSWR buys Mill Ponds, they could go ahead and build a hotel, even if they don't manage to get Waldenmere, couldn't they?
It's possible. It would put a stop to Sir Henry's plans for promenades and boathouses if he can't get the lake. But yes, the hotel could still go ahead.
The General's death is highly convenient for Sir Henry, then.
When he hears about this, he'll do everything he can to get Mill Ponds and Waldenmere.
Elijah stared morosely into his glass. I thought of General Cheverton's blood-stained body lying on the rug. What went on when I was in the kitchen with Betty? Did the doctor come? He nodded.
I stayed in the garden most of the time. The doctor and Superintendent Cobb were outside for a while. When they came out, the superintendent asked what we'd touched when we were in the study. He wanted to know if we'd handled the body or the gun or moved any of the General's papers.
Why would he think we'd touch anything?
Because someone had. A drawer of one of the cabinets was open. He thinks someone was looking for something.
He placed his glass on the table and lit a cigarette. Probably the General himself. Betty said he was always losing his pipe or spectacles. He could have been searching for a letter or something and pulled open the drawer to find it. Then picked up the shotgun and it accidentally went off. Even to my ears, this sounded an unlikely scenario. Elijah leant forward and lowered his voice.
Cobb said the shotgun didn't kill him.
I gaped at him. It must have done. Even I could tell it was a bullet wound. Why doesn't he think it was the shotgun?
Because it hadn't been fired.
Chapter 4. I heard what happened. I wanted to see if Betty needed anything. The following morning, I came down to breakfast to find my friend Alice Thackeray seated at the kitchen table. I've persuaded her to stay in bed a while longer. Lizzie was at the stove, filling our old brown teapot with boiling water. She's done in. When my father was away, I usually ate my meals in the kitchen with Lizzie. Had I known we were going to have Alice and Betty to breakfast, I might have suggested we use the dining room. But Alice seemed happy where she was. You look dreadful, love, Lizzie said. Why don't you go back to bed? I rubbed my eyes, trying to wake up. I'd spent a restless night, dreaming of General Cheverton alive and laughing, only to turn into a grey corpse. I was aware my face was pale and blotchy, and my hair was sticking out in odd directions. Ben Gilbert's coming over. Betty was too upset to answer questions yesterday, but Superintendent Cobb wants him to take a statement from her. And me. I glanced at my watch. He'd be arriving soon. I still can't believe it. Alice poured me a cup of tea. Poor Uncle Samuel. He'd been more like a grandfather than an uncle to Alice, but the childhood title had stuck. Did he have any family? I wanted to know who would inherit Mill Ponds. No children of his own, Alice replied. Just Nathan, his nephew. The General's wife died in 1911. Betty nursed her through her last year. Lizzie joined us at the table. She adored her mistress. Betty and the General loved it when the house was full of people. She cooked and cleaned for all the soldiers stationed at Mill Ponds. Alice became tearful. What's she going to do now? Betty likes looking after people. Lizzie nodded. She was a great comfort when I lost my Albert. I don't know what I'd have done without her. Lizzie's husband had died in 1912. We'd moved to London the year after his death, and she'd chosen to come with us. But she'd never taken to life in the city and had been delighted by our return to Walden. I wonder what will happen to Mill Ponds. I hoped it would stay in General Cheverton's family, safely out of Sir Henry's reach. I think it will go to Nathan, Alice said. Father suggested converting it into a convalescent home, but Uncle Samuel wasn't keen. The doorbell rang and Lizzie pushed back her chair. Iris, take Ben into the drawing room. I'll go upstairs and see how Betty is. Tell her I'll call again later. Alice followed me out into the hallway. I let Ben in and pretended not to notice the whispered exchange and brief touch of hands as he and Alice crossed on the doorstep. Ben sat in the leather armchair and took out his notebook. Tell me what happened yesterday afternoon when you and Elijah arrived at Mill Ponds. What time was that? I recounted the previous day's events, explaining about our meeting with Sir Henry Ballard and our sudden decision to call on General Cheverton. The train got in at 5:15. We walked to Mill Ponds from the station. I suppose it was about 5:20 when we knocked on the door. Did you see anyone on your way over there? A few people got off the train. As far as I can remember, they all walked towards the town. We were the only ones to cut across the concourse and take the lake path. You didn't see anyone by the lake or near the house? I shook my head. It was quiet. Betty said she went out at around 3:30 when the General went upstairs for a nap. He frowned in thought, tapping his pen on his notepad.